Elon Musk protects homeless veteran from attack. What happens next is shocking. The night air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of damp asphalt as the city lights flickered against the darkening sky. The streets were alive with movement. People rushing home from work, couples heading to late-night dinners, and cars honking impatiently at crowded intersections. Amidst the chaos of the city, an old man sat hunched over on the cold pavement, his belongings packed into a tattered backpack beside him. His face was weathered, his beard unkempt, and his hands trembled slightly as he pulled his ragged coat tighter around himself. His name was Walter Briggs, a Vietnam War veteran who had spent the last decade on the streets after a devastating series of misfortunes. Life had been unforgiving to him. After returning from war, he struggled with PTSD, lost his job, and eventually his home. With no family left to turn to, he became just another invisible figure in the city, passed by every day without a second glance. That night, Walter was sitting in his usual spot near the entrance of a high-end restaurant, a place where wealthy businessmen, celebrities, and socialites frequented. He wasn't begging, he never did, but his presence alone was enough to make some uncomfortable. A group of well-dressed men exited the restaurant, laughing and exchanging handshakes. One of them, a tall man in an expensive suit, glanced at Walter and scowled in disgust. "Ugh, this city is going to hell," the man muttered to his friend. "They just let these people sit around like this? Ruining the atmosphere?" Walter, used to hearing things like this, kept his head down. But the man wasn't done. He turned back toward Walter, his face contorted with contempt. "Hey, old man, why don't you go somewhere else? People are trying to enjoy their night without having to look at you." Walter exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. He had been through worse. "I ain't both Aaron nobody," he murmured. The man scoffed. "Yeah? Well, you're bothering me." He took a step forward, his voice rising. "People like you just sit around expecting handouts. It's pathetic. You should do something with your life instead of leeching off society." Before Walter could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Hey, back off." The group turned, and their faces immediately changed, from arrogance to disbelief. Because standing there, wearing a leather jacket and jeans, was Elon Musk. The billionaire's expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge in his voice. The well-dressed man blinked in surprise before letting out a forced laugh. "Elon Musk." He smirked, looking around as if expecting cameras to pop out. "Wow, this is unexpected." Elon ignored the fake enthusiasm and took a step closer. "You think because you're wearing an expensive suit, that gives you the right to treat people like garbage?" The man's smirk faltered. "Look, I was just saying." "You were being a bully," Elon cut in. "To a man who fought for this country." The entire group went silent. Walter looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Elon. He hadn't expected anyone to step in, especially not one of the richest men in the world. The well-dressed man scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. "Come on, Elon, you don't really care about some bum on the street. This guy's probably been sitting here for years doing nothing." Elon's gaze hardened. "And yet he's still got more dignity than you." A hush fell over the crowd that had begun to form around them. The man, now visibly uncomfortable, muttered something under his breath before turning on his heel. "Whatever. I don't have time for this." As he and his group walked away, Elon turned back to Walter, his expression softening. "You okay?" he asked. Walter chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess I've seen it all now. Elon Musk defending an old man like me." Elon smiled. "You shouldn't have to deal with people like that. It's disgusting." Walter shrugged. "You get used to it?" Elon crouched down slightly so he was at eye level. "You shouldn't have to?" For the first time in a long while, Walter saw something in a stranger's eyes that he hadn't seen in years, genuine concern. And then Elon said something that would change everything. "What's your story?" Walter hesitated. Most people never cared to ask. But something about the way Elon looked at him, like he actually wanted to know, made him decide to speak. He cleared his throat. "I served in Vietnam. Came back with some scars you can't see. I had a job, a house, lost both when things got bad. It happens fast, you know? One day you're a guy with a mortgage, the next, you're sleeping on the ground." Elon listened intently, nodding. No family? Walter shook his head. Lost my wife to cancer. No kids. Just me now. A beat of silence passed between them. Then Elon stood up and stretched his hand toward Walter. Come on, he said. Walter frowned. Come on, where? Elon smiled. You'll see. Walter hesitated, glancing down at his ragged clothes. Look, man, I appreciate what you did back there, but I don't need no charity. Elon chuckled. It's not charity. It's an opportunity. You can take it, or you can sit here and let people like that guy keep walking all over you. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and took Elon's hand. The billionaire pulled him up, and just like that, Walter's life took a turn he never could have expected. What happened next would shock everyone. Walter followed Elon through the busy streets, his steps slow and cautious. He still couldn't quite wrap his head around what was happening. Moments ago, he had been nothing more than an invisible figure on the sidewalk, just another forgotten veteran. Now, he was walking beside Elon Musk, the world's richest and most influential man. They stopped in front of a sleek black Tesla, parked along the curb. Elon opened the door and gestured for Walter to get in. Walter hesitated. You sure about this, man? Elon nodded. Yeah. Let's go. With a sigh, Walter slid into the passenger seat, sinking into the soft leather. The car smelled new, clean, so different from the streets he had grown used to. As Elon got in and started driving, Walter looked around in awe. He had never been inside a car like this before. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Walter wasn't sure where they were going, and he wasn't about to ask. He had learned a long time ago that when someone offers you a way out, you don't question it, you just take it. Elon finally broke the silence. You ever hear of the Musk Foundation? Walter shook his head. Can't say I have. Elon nodded. It's my foundation. We work on a lot of things: education, renewable energy, disaster relief. But one thing we've been working on for a while is a program to help veterans get back on their feet. Walter turned to look at him, skepticism creeping into his eyes. You mean like some kind of shelter? Elon shook his head. No. I'm not talking about giving you a cot in some overcrowded building. I'm talking about a real opportunity. A job, a home, something sustainable. A fresh start. Walter let out a dry chuckle. Sounds too good to be true. Elon smirked. Most good things do. They drove out of the city, past the glittering skyscrapers and into a quieter, more suburban area. After about 20 minutes, Elon pulled into a gated property. A modern, minimalist building with large glass windows and a futuristic design. As they drove through, Walter noticed several small houses lined up neatly on a quiet street, each one brand new. A few men were outside, some working on cars, others sitting on porches, chatting. They didn't look like rich folks. They looked like him. Veterans. Elon parked the car and turned to Walter. Welcome to the next chapter of your life. Walter narrowed his eyes. What is this place? Elon smiled. A new initiative I've been working on. We call it the Phoenix Project. It's a community for homeless veterans, one that doesn't just give them a bed for the night, but gives them a real shot at rebuilding their lives. Walter exhaled slowly, taking it all in. He had spent years drifting, convinced that no one cared, that the system had forgotten him. And now, here he was, being handed a second chance by someone he never expected. Elon stepped out of the car, and Walter followed, still looking around in disbelief. A man in his 50s, wearing a navy blue shirt with the Phoenix Project logo on it, walked over with a welcoming smile. Elon, good to see you, man. He turned to Walter, extending his hand. You must be the new guy. Name's David. Served in Iraq. You? Walter shook his hand, still a little stunned. Vietnam. David nodded respectfully. Well, you're in the right place, brother. Come on, let me show you around. Walter followed David as he gave him a tour of the property. Each house was fully furnished, with a kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom, not just a cot in a shelter, but an actual home. There was a community center, a gym, even a training facility where the vets could learn new skills. We help guys get back into the workforce, David explained. Whether it's through trade jobs, business programs, or even tech. Elon set up some partnerships with companies that are willing to hire veterans straight out of here. Walter shook his head in disbelief. And this is real? David chuckled. As real as it gets. Elon walked up beside them, hands in his pockets. So, what do you think? Walter was quiet for a long moment, his throat tight with emotion. Think, I ain't had a home in a long time. He turned to Elon. You really doing this for people like me? Elon nodded. I believe in solutions, Walter. Not just band-aids. The system's broken, but that doesn't mean we can't fix it. Walter swallowed hard, trying to process what was happening. What's the catch? Elon grinned. The only catch is that you gotta want it. We don't do handouts, we do opportunities. You gotta be willing to put in the work. Walter exhaled, looking around again. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. After a beat, he nodded. All right then. Where do I start? David clapped him on the back. That's the spirit. Come on, let's get you settled in. As they walked toward one of the houses, Walter turned back toward Elon. Why you doing all this, man? You got all the money in the world. Why care about a guy like me? Elon thought about it for a moment before answering. Because the world only moves forward when we lift each other up. Walter nodded slowly, letting those words sink in. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. And it all started with one unexpected act of kindness. Walter sat on the edge of the neatly made bed in his new home, running his calloused hands over the soft, clean sheets. It had been years since he had a real place to sleep, one that wasn't a shelter cot, a park bench, or a piece of cardboard on the sidewalk. The room smelled fresh, the air felt warm, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt safe. David stood in the doorway, watching him with a knowing smile. We all had that same look when we got here, he said. Walter exhaled, shaking his head. It don't feel real. David chuckled. We'll give it time. Walter nodded slowly, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was too good to be true. He had been let down too many times before. He had learned not to expect much from the world. And yet, Elon Musk had changed everything in a matter of hours. After a few moments of silence, David clapped his hands together. All right, enough staring at the walls. You hungry? Walter's stomach growled in response, and David laughed. Come on, let's hit the mess hall. You're gonna love what we got here. They walked over to the community center, a sleek, modern building with a cafeteria, lounge area, and several rooms designed for skill training and workshops. The entire facility was buzzing with activity, men and women of all ages, most of them veterans, talking, eating, and working together. Walter couldn't believe it. For years, he had felt utterly alone. Now, he was surrounded by people who had walked the same path as him. As they grabbed trays of food, steak, mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, Walter shook his head in disbelief. Man, this ain't no shelter food. David smirked. Told you, brother. We ain't about just scraping by. We're about living again. Walter sat down at a table and took his first bite. The warmth of the food spread through him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt human again. Across the table, David watched him carefully. So what's next for you? Walter swallowed, glancing around. Guess that depends. What kind of work y'all got here? David grinned. We got options. Tech training, construction, auto repair, business programs. We even got a few guys who work remotely doing customer service. The idea is to get you on your feet doing something you enjoy, not just what you have to do to survive. Walter thought about it. He had worked in construction decades ago, before his life had spiraled out of control. His hands might not be as strong as they once were, but he still knew how to work with them. Think I could get back into building things? David nodded. Absolutely. We got partnerships with some big companies, plus we're working on new tiny homes for veterans. You could be part of the crew building them. Walter's chest tightened. The idea of helping other guys like him, giving them a home like the one he had just received, it felt right. I'd like that, he said softly. David smiled. Then it's done. Suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the cafeteria. Walter. He turned, and there stood Elon Musk, hands in his pockets, flashing that casual smirk of his. Walter stood, feeling slightly awkward. But didn't expect to see you again so soon. Elon shrugged. Had to check in on my newest recruit. Walter chuckled. Well, I ain't run off yet, so I guess that's a good sign. Elon sat down across from him, stealing a fry off Walter's plate like they were old friends. So what's the plan? Walter glanced at David, then back at Elon. Think I'm gonna try my hand at construction again. Help build some of these houses? Elon nodded approvingly. Good choice. You'll be building futures, not just homes. Walter smirked. Never thought I'd be having this conversation with Elon Musk, that's for damn sure. Elon grinned. Life's full of surprises. For the first time in years, Walter believed that might actually be true. The work begins. Over the next few weeks, Walter threw himself into his new life. He worked alongside a team of veterans, constructing affordable housing units for men and women who had once been in his shoes. Every nail he hammered, every wall he put up, felt like rebuilding a part of himself. At night, he slept in a real bed. In the mornings, he drank coffee on his front porch, watching the sunrise, something he hadn't done in decades. Slowly but surely, he was coming back to life. One evening, as he was finishing up work on a nearly completed house, Elon arrived at the site. Walter wiped the sweat from his forehead. Didn't expect a billionaire to come check on the grunt work? Elon laughed. Gotta make sure you guys aren't slacking off. Walter chuckled. Namit, we're building history here. Elon's eyes gleamed. Exactly. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as another home took shape before them. Then Elon turned to Walter. You ever think about what's next? Walter frowned. What you mean? Elon leaned against a nearby beam. You've come a long way in a short time. But this doesn't have to be the end of the road. You ever think about leading? Walter blinked. Leading? Elon nodded. We need guys like you. Guys who've lived it, who know what it's like, to help run this thing. You interested? Walter hesitated. He had always seen himself as the one being helped, not the one helping. But maybe that was just because no one had ever given him the chance before. And now, here he was. A man who had spent years being ignored was now being asked to lead a movement. He exhaled deeply. You really think I can do that? Elon smirked. I don't think. I know. Walter let the words sink in. For the first time in years, he wasn't just thinking about surviving. He was thinking about the future. His future. And for the first time in a long time, it looked bright. Walter stood in the middle of the construction site, staring at the skeletal frame of a house that was beginning to take shape. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the rows of new homes being built. Homes for veterans. Homes for people who had once been forgotten, just like he had been. A few months ago, he had been living in the shadows, a nameless figure on the streets, ignored by society. Now, he was part of something bigger than himself. And what's more, Elon Musk had just asked him to lead. The thought both excited and terrified him. He wasn't a leader. He had spent most of his life fighting to survive, not calling the shots. But Elon had seen something in him. And maybe, just maybe, he had been given this chance for a reason. David walked up beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. Looks good, doesn't it? Walter nodded. Yeah. Never thought I'd be a part of something like this. David chuckled. None of us did, man. That's the beauty of it. Walter hesitated for a moment before speaking. Elon wants me to take on a leadership role. David's eyebrows raised. No kidding. Walter shook his head. I don't know if I'm cut out for it. David studied him for a moment before nodding toward the houses. You see all this? This place wouldn't exist without guys like us. People who understand what it means to hit rock bottom and climb back up. You think some corporate suit can run this? Moment. We need leaders who've lived it. That's why Elon's looking at you. Walter exhaled, letting those words settle. Could he really do it? Maybe it was time to stop doubting himself. Maybe it was time to step up. The next morning, he found himself sitting in a meeting room inside the community center, surrounded by other veterans who had taken leadership roles in the project. Elon was at the front, leaning against a table with that casual confidence of his, addressing the group. This place is already making waves, Elon said. We're getting requests from cities all over the country to expand the program. But that means we need people who can run things at a higher level. He turned to Walter. You ready for this? Walter took a deep breath. I think so. Elon smirked. Wrong answer. Walter frowned. What? Elon leaned forward. I don't need you to think so. I need you to know. You don't have to be perfect, but you gotta own it. These guys will look to you for guidance. If you hesitate, so will they. Walter sat back, considering his words. Elon was right. Confidence wasn't about knowing everything. It was about believing in yourself even when you didn't. Walter straightened his shoulders. All right, I'm in. Elon nodded. Good. Let's get to work. Stepping up, Walter was thrown into the deep end immediately. His first task? Overseeing the next expansion phase of the Phoenix project, which meant hiring more veterans, organizing resources, and ensuring that the new houses were completed on time. It was overwhelming at first. There were budgets to manage, materials to track, and people to lead. He had never done anything like this before. But he learned quickly that leadership wasn't about knowing everything. It was about problem-solving, adapting, and trusting the people around you. One day, as he was walking through the construction site, he noticed a younger veteran, Jake, struggling with a power saw. Walter walked over. Everything all right? Jake sighed. First time using one of these. I was a medic in the army, not a carpenter. Walter chuckled. Well, lucky for you, I know a thing or two. He showed Jake how to properly handle the saw, guiding him through the motions until he got the hang of it. Within minutes, Jake was working like a pro. Jake grinned. Appreciate that, man. Walter patted him on the shoulder. We all start somewhere. As he walked away, he realized something. He had just done exactly what Elon had done for him, given someone a shot, shown them the way. Maybe he really was a leader, a growing movement. Months passed, and the Phoenix project exploded in growth. More companies donated resources, more veterans found stable housing and careers, and the media started paying serious attention. News outlets ran headlines like, Police car light Elon Musk's revolutionary housing project for homeless veterans is changing lives. Police car lights from the streets to leadership, the inspiring story of Walter Brigg. Walter couldn't believe it. His name was being mentioned on TV, in newspapers, on social media. He wasn't just another homeless veteran anymore. He was a symbol of hope. One evening, Elon invited him to a fundraising gala, an exclusive event attended by CEOs, politicians, and celebrities, all of whom were now interested in supporting the project. Walter was out of his element in the fancy ballroom, surrounded by millionaires in tuxedos. But then Elon clapped a hand on his shoulder. Just be yourself, man, he said. They need to hear your story. And so he did. Standing on the stage, Walter told the truth. About his struggles, about being forgotten, about the night Elon had stepped in and changed everything. He spoke not just for himself, but for every veteran who had been abandoned by the system. By the end of his speech, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. And when the donations started pouring in, Elon leaned over and smirked. See? Told you were a leader. The final test. One day, as Walter was walking through the community, he noticed a man sitting outside one of the houses. He was older, disheveled, and staring blankly at the ground, just like Walter had been not too long ago. Walter approached and sat next to him. New here? The man glanced at him, his eyes tired. Yeah. What's your name? The man hesitated. Frank. Walter nodded. Where you from, Frank? Frank swallowed hard. Korea. Army. Walter knew that look. The same lost, broken feeling he had carried for years. And suddenly he understood. It wasn't just about building houses. It wasn't just about getting people off the streets. It was about making them believe in themselves again. Walter leaned forward. You're in the right place, Frank. We're gonna help you get back on your feet. Frank exhaled, and for the first time, Walter saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. At that moment, he realized something. His journey had come full circle. Once, he had been the one sitting on that sidewalk, ignored, dismissed. But he was the one offering a hand. And he wouldn't let anyone slip through the cracks again. The night was calm as Walter sat outside his small but comfortable home, looking up at the stars. The sounds of hammers and drills had faded for the day, replaced by the soft hum of conversation among the residents of the Phoenix Project. Laughter echoed from the community center, where a group of veterans was gathered, playing cards and swapping stories. Walter took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He had come so far. For years, he had wandered the streets, feeling like nothing more than a shadow. But now, he had a home, a purpose, a family. And yet, there was still one thing missing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled, yellowed letter. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had started to tear. It was a letter from his daughter. The last time he had seen her, she was just a little girl, hugging his leg as he packed his bags to leave for Vietnam. He had promised he would come home, promised that he would always be there for her. But life had gotten in the way. When he came back, he wasn't the same man. The war had taken its toll. He had tried, for years, to be the father she deserved, but he had failed. And when he lost everything, his job, his home, he had pushed her away, too ashamed to let her see what he had become. The last time she wrote to him had been 10 years ago. "Dad, I don't care where you are or what happened. I just want to know you're okay. Please write back." He had never answered. But now things were different. For the first time in decades, he wasn't ashamed of who he was. He was proud. With trembling hands, he pulled out a pen and a fresh piece of paper. He stared at it for a long moment before finally pressing the tip to the page. "Dear Emily, rebuilding bridges." A few weeks later, Walter sat nervously at a small diner on the outskirts of town. The coffee in front of him had long gone cold, but he hadn't taken a sip. He was too anxious. He had sent the letter. And to his shock, Emily had written back almost immediately. "Dad, I don't care how long it's been. I just want to see you." And now, after all these years, he was about to. The doorbell chimed, and Walter's breath caught in his throat. He looked up, and there she was. Emily. She was no longer the little girl he remembered. She was a grown woman now, with streaks of gray in her brown hair and lines on her face that spoke of years of waiting, of wondering. But the moment her eyes met his, they filled with tears. "Dad?" she whispered. Walter stood, feeling his own eyes sting. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to tell her how much he had missed her, but before he could get a word out, she rushed forward and wrapped her arms around him. And just like that, the years of silence, shame, and regret melted away. "I thought I lost you," she sobbed into his shoulder. Walter swallowed hard, hugging her tighter. "You didn't, baby girl. I was lost, but I found my way back." The final test. Months passed, and Walter fully embraced his role as a leader in the Phoenix Project. He trained new residents, helped expand the program, and even worked with Elon to secure funding to bring the initiative to other cities. But the real test came on a cold December night. Walter had just finished a long day at the site when his phone buzzed. It was David. "You need to get down to the city," David said, his voice tense. "We got a situation." Walter didn't ask questions. He jumped into his truck and drove back to the streets he had once called home. When he arrived, his heart sank. A group of police officers stood around a thin, trembling man who was huddled in an alleyway, clutching a bottle in one hand and an old, ragged coat in the other. It was Frank, the same man Walter had spoken to when he first stepped into his leadership role. The man he had promised to help. But Frank had disappeared months ago. No one had seen or heard from him since. And now, he was back where Walter had once been, on the streets, alone, broken. Walter approached the officers. "Let me talk to him." One of them sighed. "He's refusing to leave. Says he doesn't want help." Walter knelt beside Frank, who barely registered his presence. His eyes were hollow, filled with the kind of exhaustion that only comes from fighting a losing battle for too long. "Frank," Walter said gently. Frank didn't look at him. "Ain't no place for me there, Walter." Walter's chest tightened. "That's not true." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "I had my chance. I messed it up. I don't belong." Walter understood. He had felt the same way once. He could have walked away, could have let the officers handle it. But instead, he did something that Elon had done for him all those months ago. He reached out his hand. "You're not done yet, Frank. You hear me?" Walter's voice was firm, unwavering. "I know what it's like to feel like you don't deserve a second chance. I know what it's like to believe you're too far gone." Frank shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "But you're not," Walter continued. "And I'll be damned if I let you give up." For a long moment, Frank just stared at him. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took Walter's hand. And just like that, another life was saved. A legacy of hope. Years passed, and the Phoenix Project expanded across the country. What had started as a single community became a nationwide movement, helping thousands of veterans find homes, jobs, and most importantly, purpose. Walter never stopped working. He never stopped building. But one day, as he was overseeing a new construction site, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned, and there stood Elon Musk, a knowing smile on his face. "Still at it, huh?" Elon asked. Walter grinned. "You know me. Can't sit still for too long." Elon chuckled. "Well, I got something for you." He pulled a set of keys from his pocket and handed them to Walter. Walter frowned. "What's this?" Elon smirked. "Your next challenge." Walter looked up and saw a brand new facility under construction. It was bigger than anything they had built before. And above the entrance, in bold letters, was a name that made his heart stop. The Walter Briggs Center for Veterans. Walter's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Elon, his hands shaking. You named it after me?" Elon clapped him on the back. "You earned it." Walter looked at the building, then at the man who had changed his life, and finally, at the group of veterans watching him with hope in their eyes. Tears welled in his own eyes as he realized something. This was his legacy. And for the first time in his life, he knew he had truly made a difference.